it's my honor to introduce somebody I've been working with for a long time and known for a long time, who's now achieved something that very few people have been able to achieve. Matter of fact, nobody else was honestly able to do that in New York. So, Diane, welcome, and go right ahead.
Well, thanks very much, Dennis, and also thank you, Helga, for that beautiful speech, which will help people to get through what I'm about to say to them, I think. My question to Americans: are you the slowly cooked frog? Time to get out of or off the pot. The reason why it is now possible to do the impossible, namely to establish a new order among nations based on the principles of the Treaty of Westphalia, is because we in the so-called Western world have gone at least as mad as we were during the 150 years of bloody religious strife which tore Europe apart until 1648. The situation is so desperate and so bizarre that it is dawning on millions of people that something has to be done, which is not in the normal way of doing things, at least not in the last 70 years or so. Think about what we are seeing. Mass shootings in the United States, in schools and shopping centers, as well as massive numbers of non-mass shootings, record drug overdose deaths, 53 migrants dead in an 18-wheeler truck, each of whom probably paid a fortune to end up like that, in desperation not to end up dead by some other means, at least they hoped. Migrants from Africa and Southwest Asia are being repelled with hoses and tear gas by so-called civilized and democratic nations. These same civilized nations are giving tens of billions of dollars to literal Nazis in Ukraine who are committing hideous war crimes, which are documented and videotaped, but are not being investigated in the West. We have Liz Cheney, the daughter of the notorious Dick Cheney, who loved to torture people and launch forever wars based on lies. She sees no need to distance herself from her father's positions. But she has now become the darling of the so-called Democratic Party for her role in trying to make sure that Donald Trump never runs for president or any office ever again, as opposed to allowing the voters to make that decision, claiming that January 6th, which should be investigated, but not by her kangaroo court, was worse than 9/11, about which I might add, we still don't know the truth, although we are supplying billions of dollars worth of weapons to the Saudis so they can kill millions of children in Yemen through bombing and starvation. Do you not think we've gone mad? In New York City, the New York City Housing Authority needs $40 billion in repairs for apartments which house, it's disputed, 400,000 to 600,000, so 500,000 people. These are not minor repairs. They include things like dripping sewage water, gas leaks, rat infestations, people not having gas for cooking or heating for months, no ventilation. But rather than pay for this, our genius Congress, with a handful of courageous dissenters, who are also now trying to be drummed out of the Congress, voted to send not the $33 billion requested by Biden to the Nazis in Ukraine, but increased it to $40 billion, the exact amount of money needed by NYCHA. Ukraine, which, and you're probably not surprised to hear a fascist government broke its promise, is now launching missiles into Russian cities, killing civilians inside Russia, something Zelensky promised Biden they would not do if we sent them longer range missiles. And now we're going to send them another $800 million. So before we give up and conclude that it's hopeless and nuclear war is around the corner, which it might be, the truth is that most Americans, and I think probably most people in Western Europe, reject these insane policies. In fact, there's tens of thousands of people in the streets, farmers, largely right now, and others, 80,000 people demonstrating against NATO in Brussels. The US military is having a hard time recruiting right now. And as Dennis mentioned earlier, a certain LaRouche-affiliated candidate for US Senate was able to get over 66,000 signatures from New York voters when no other statewide independent candidate was able to do it. The fact that the price of gasoline and food is soaring out of reach for working families is certainly another factor propelling people toward a change. But what will the change be? That's why it's so urgent that Helga has called for the recent conferences of the Schiller Institute. We have a job to put the solution on the table and to make sure that as many people know about it as possible and quickly. But we need more than a thing or a list of do's and don'ts. The people in the nations which have gone mad need to take a step away from the negativity of fear and rage and anxiety and consider what we must do now. What are the changes which are urgently needed, which will allow an imperiled mankind not only to survive, but to increase and multiply happily and prosperously? The question to be thought through is, what is the nature of man and how does human activity contribute to the ongoing negentropic development of the biosphere? And I would really encourage everyone to review the science panel from June 18th and 19th, the Schiller Institute conference, to get an introduction to the work of the Russian scientist Vladimir Vernadsky and the relationship of his work to the breakthroughs made by Lyndon LaRouche. LaRouche used two terms which provide the key to sound economic policy and which must be the guidepost for our new Bretton Woods system: energy flux density and potential relative population density. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But let me just ask you for a minute to reflect about the development of our planet over a few billion years. We certainly don't know how life began, but we do know that the first life was extremely simple, single-celled creatures, which at some point, somewhere between 2 and 3 billion, or maybe 3.5 billion years ago, suddenly be able to convert light from the sun into oxygen, a process of photosynthesis. This actually was bacteria, specifically cyanobacteria, and perhaps was part of how our atmosphere came to exist on this planet. At any rate, this was long before we had human measuring instruments. We have fossils, there are hypotheses. But at any rate, life began developing, first in water, plants, and then self-contained, self-propelling animals. Now, do you suppose, or what do you think uses more energy? A clump of seaweed that's just swaying there in the ocean, or a jellyfish which is pulsating and actually moves itself a bit? What about a clam? What about a fish? Which of them use more energy and more condensed energy to exist? How about the frog that we were talking about earlier, which can stay underwater for some time, but now actually can breathe air and hop around on land outside of the water? What's the caloric intake of a frog per gram or per ounce that it weighs as opposed to that of a jellyfish? I don't know, but I suspect a frog needs more calories than a jellyfish. And I would like you to consider also that this evolution was not gradual or linear, but happened in leaps. many of the less self-sufficient life forms went extinct. They couldn't survive certain changes that occurred, or they hit a dead end. And actually about 99% of everything that existed, every species that has existed, has gone extinct. But after these extinctions, more independent forms of life, more sovereign life sprang into existence. Think about mammals. They self-regulate their body temperature. That requires an enormous amount of energy compared to a reptile like a snake, which just gets warm by lying on a rock in the sun, and then in the winter just hides under the rock. But human beings represent a complete leap beyond all of this, but we are a natural part of the development, the Negentropic, that is the more complex, more energy dense development of our planet, our biosphere, and our universe. Not only are we mammals, but we are the only species which can transform our species at will. And you can think about the leap in our productivity and requirements when somebody discovered how to put wheels on a cart as opposed to just dragging things on the ground. Suddenly, you could move heavier goods to much greater distances, and think about how that would affect the standard of living. Think about the discovery of the use of fire for cooking food, for heat in the winter, and then later for a steam engine. These breakthroughs occurred not because someone arbitrarily spouted an extra arm or a foot, not by some linear Darwinian process of development, but in the domain of the human mind and free will. The mind is an organ which exists nowhere, although it has a mysterious relationship to the brain, which we still have to do a lot of work on. But we're endowed, humankind has been endowed this special characteristic of creativity by the creator of the universe. This approach of transforming man's power over nature is the key, not merely to survival, but to excelling as a species. And I wanted to share also from Lincoln part of a speech that he gave before he was president of the United States to the Wisconsin State Agricultural Society, where he's talking about farming. He says, again, a great amount of locomotion is spared by thorough cultivation. Take 50 bushels of wheat ready for the harvest, standing upon a single acre, and it can be harvested in any of the known ways with less than half the labor which would be required if it were spread over 5 acres. This would be true if cut by the old hand sickle, true to a greater extent if by the scythe and cradle, and to a still greater extent if by the machines now in use. And later he goes on to talk about whether they're going to have steam-powered machines in the farms. So he's describing an increase in what you call energy flux density, that you would be putting more energy per acre into your acre than you would if everything were spread out over 5 acres, but you're getting a 5-fold increase in the amount of wheat that can be produced. That means you're condensing your production of 50 bushels of wheat into 1 acre from 5, and then the amount of labor, he said, is maybe less than half of what it takes. So you require overall less labor, but more labor per acre, but you get a 5-fold result. So you can think of this another way. If I took a baseball bat to try to cut an apple or smash an apple, and especially if I didn't swing it over my head, but I just pushed it down on the apple, that would require an enormous amount of force. Whereas if I had a very sharp knife, it wouldn't require that much force at all. But the pressure, the energy of that would all be condensed into this little tiny blade. So think about the silly people in Poland and Lithuania, who are now going to go back to burning wood as opposed to using fossil fuels, because that's part of the sanctions on Russia and also the refusal of people to build new nuclear power plants. Now, I wanted to go through this because there are two really important points, one of which Helga touched on already in LaRouche's 4 laws. The development of fusion power is not a, It is not something that's just up to your own opinion or we can do it or not. It is actually a life or death question. For mankind to survive, we have to grow. You cannot reverse this process. You can only increase this process. And that means we have to develop forms of energy that are orders of magnitude more dense and hotter than the kinds of energy we have today. And fusion is the way to go. And there are other forms that come after that. Number 2, which I'm hoping will become more clear to you, is that the whole premise of the environmentalist movement is satanic. It is actually the total reverse of nature, because it demands that we go from higher levels of energy flux density to lower levels of energy. In other words, the exact opposite of the way the entire universe is constructed and the universe develops. And what we are seeing is that by decreasing the amount of energy on this planet per capita and per given land area, closing down nuclear power plants, and then even banning fossil fuels and going to things like windmills and solar panels, which require vast, vast areas of land for no energy and very unreliable energy, will actually lead to a hyperbolic increase in the death rate. So I don't think it's an accident that Prince Charles and his bankers' dictatorship are calling for this. And I think people should reflect why our proposal for a new Bretton Woods is so urgent, why years ago the British Empire said that to reinstate Glass-Steagall, merely that, would be considered an act of war. We are asserting the natural principles of the development of the universe. They are asserting the opposite. So the point of an ad hoc committee for a new Bretton Woods is to lay the basis in human economic policy for mankind to increase the potential relative population density on this planet by increasing energy flux density. It is not to be a series of monetarist agreements which merely alleviate debt or allow poor people to have more money, as if you could measure anything important in terms of money. I would ask everyone to imagine instead where mankind could be 100 years from now. Will the earth have 30 billion people on it, living in gleaming new spotless cities, traveling on trains at 500 miles per hour? With beautiful nature preserves, with pristine lakes and forests that are managed by human beings? The first colony on Mars might have a few thousand settlers by then, and we might have discovered several dozen more inhabitable planets and be on our way to figuring out how to get there. The task before us now, which everyone watching should join and help to do this, is how do we get from here to there? Obviously, war has to become a thing of the past, and mature adults have to be brought into policy making. We will have to liberate our neighbors from all of the brainwashing that's been done against those nations which are actually attempting to move in the direction that I've indicated. The irony is that the worse the situation gets, the more likely it is that people will listen to us. But the question which should impel all of us to move boldly is, will it happen in time? Thank you.